I have had the pleasure of interviewing Beth Macy 3 times before. I'm the editor of the New York Times Book Review, and I host the weekly podcast. And Beth has been on, I want to say, in quick succession, 3 times, 3 major books. 2014, her first book, Factory Man, a national bestseller. 2016, True Vine. And 2018, Dopesick, which we're going to talk about in detail today. It's just out in paperback. And we're also going to talk about her first audio documentary. It's an Audible original coming in October called Finding Tess, a mother's search for answers in a dope-sick America. And that's October 3rd. So we'll talk mostly about Dopesick, but also about that book and the differences between writing for print and writing for audio. Beth, it's such an honor and a pleasure to have you here.
The honor is mine, thank you.
And we will... We will leave time for questions from all of you, 15 minutes at the end. There are microphones on either side, so when I give the sort of let you know, just line up at the microphones and we'll take your questions as well. So let's start with the big substantive question. This is a book about the opioid epidemic. Give us a sense of the scale of the opioid epidemic in this country.
Well, according to the official figures, we've lost 2.6 million Americans. I'm sorry, we have lost 400,000 Americans to the opioid crisis. That's opioid pills and heroin and fentanyl. We have 2.6 million people addicted right now, although some people think that number could be as high as 15 million. And if you just look at the most recent figures, 2017, we lost about 70,000 to drug overdose, about 3/4 of them opioid related. Every one of them a tragedy, not just those people, but also think about their friends and their families.
How did it start? It didn't start primarily with heroin, which has been around for a long time.
It started with what scientists call an iatrogenic epidemic, and that's a doctor created overprescribing of opioid pills. We knew for 100 years, because we had a morphine epidemic after the Civil War, we knew for 100 years that opioids were only to be used in instances of cancer, end of life, severe pain. And what Purdue Pharma did initially when they introduced OxyContin in 1996 was they paid money to change the narrative. They targeted doctors and they told them that their new drug, OxyContin, was safe because it had this time-release mechanism. And a lot of regulatory failures in this story too. The FDA allowed them to say, because of this new time-release mechanism, it's believed to reduce the liability of addiction and abuse.
So the content means continuous or that it releases over time. But what did users discover pretty quickly?
They could quickly do an end run around it. They would take the pill, put it in their mouth, and it sort of told you in the insert not to do it. So it was kind of like Reader's Guide for misusing OxyContin. But they would put the pill in the mouth and it would melt off the coating, and that's what was the time release mechanism. And then I found the first cop that saw it being diverted on the street, and he said you would see people with orange and green smudges on their sleeves from the 40 milligram and the 80 milligrams. So they wipe it off, and then they would either crush it or shoot it up. Or just, actually, frankly, they could just chew it and get the full bump as well.
So this is a very powerful synthetic opioid. But it wasn't, as you said, it was supposed to be for cancer, for end of life, for very serious surgical recovery. What did it end up being prescribed for?
Moderate pain, TMJ. Any type A person in this room probably suffers from TMJ. An ankle sprain, back pain. Who doesn't have a little back pain? And wisdom teeth surgery. I tell people whose kids, I have a son in college, like his friends are all having wisdom teeth surgery now. Do not take those meds. Probably ibuprofen is gonna be just fine. But what they did is they flipped the narrative that we knew for 100 years, and they said, no, it's safe for moderate pain, and it wasn't safe.
How addictive is it?
Experts believe you can get physically dependent on opioids in as little as 5 days.
Wow. So Purdue is obviously the sort of the genesis of the problem, but as you said, it was being prescribed by doctors. How culpable is the medical profession in this epidemic?
Well, there were definitely some bad actors, and we've all heard about the doctors running the pill mills and that kind of thing. But we have to remember that there was this coordinated effort to tell doctors that this drug was safe. And at the time, this is when commercials on TV were starting to, for everything, not for opioids, but other pharmaceutical commercials. So there's trying to get Americans comfortable with the idea that there's a pill for every ill. But also, Purdue hired an army of sales reps to go out and to target doctors, and they bought this data that showed them which doctors were already prescribing competing immediate-release opioids, because knowing that they would be a better sell for their product. So not only did they hit those doctors armed with the information of exactly which doctors they were, and they tended to be in distressed places with high instances of workplace injuries, but they also came bearing gifts. You have a chapter in the book called Swag and Dash. So if you were a doctor and you liked cigars, they would find that out, and they would show up with the very finest Cuban cigars in exchange for a little bit of your time. And we all know, because the research is there, that doctors are more than twice as likely to prescribe a drug if somebody's brought them a delicious lunch and a Cuban cigar.
What about the victims? I mean, you mentioned that there were particular areas that were hard hit because they had high incidence of workplace injuries. Did this end up being overly prescribed to certain segments of the population?
Yeah, so it first breaks out as a real problem in central Appalachia. I mean, even if you look now, West Virginia is the highest, but it's all of central Appalachia. And I came to this story from Western Virginia, where the court case also took place. But they targeted those areas, so it was coal mining, logging, fishing village. Machias, Maine was one of the first hot spots. These are places where there were legitimate workplace injuries, but also jobs and factories going away, factories closing. Martinsville, Virginia, which I talk a lot about in Factory Man, which was my first book about the aftermath of globalization. Lo and behold, after Factory Man comes out, we then find out that that's the highest opioid prescribing rate in the nation in 2015. We were just so slow to put the stories together, the pieces of the story.
So it starts off in Appalachia, and then how does it spread out, and how does it go beyond the sort of the blue-collar workers?
Yeah, so I try to tell the story from, I picked a spot and went deep in Lee County, Virginia, which is the furthernmost. And then I pick up the story when I was a reporter in Roanoke, when heroin becomes a problem in the cities and suburbs. And at the time, I was writing a lot about marginalized communities. But the story on everybody's mind that summer was the fact that a wealthy kid, the son of a prominent civic leader, was about to go to prison for 5 years for his role in selling the heroin to his former private school classmate. And I did this 3-part series on the front page, and readers kind of went, wealthy white kids are doing heroin? Mm-hmm. We had no idea. And I actually pitched this to be my second book, both to my agent and my editor in New York. No offense, New York editors, in a bit of a bubble, but my agent said, I think Roanoke's just late getting it, like it was a trend. Mm-hmm. But what it was is those young men started out like 3/4 of heroin users do, by taking pills, opioid pills from their parents and grandparents' medicine cabinets, or some had been prescribed for legitimate sports injuries. And then once you get hooked, I mean, the whole reason the book's called Dopesick, at the end of your journey, you're not shooting up heroin because you want to get high, you're doing it so you won't be dopesick. You won't be in this excruciating pain, vomiting, diarrhea, nausea, sweats, crushing anxiety and depression. And once they get hooked, that's why they're doing it. So once the pills got hard to get, became more expensive, the DEA belatedly starts cracking down. You and I may not have known that heroin and OxyContin are chemical cousins, but the drug dealers sure did.
I'm interested in how it reached kids in a very different way from other drugs, in that it doesn't start off with street drugs for many of these kids, right? They were prescribed by their doctors for getting teeth pulled, as you said, for sports injuries. Is that?
That's one avenue, but also just the kids passing pills around at parties. They called them farm parties, PHARM. And because these companies made these drugs oversupplied in our America's communal medicine cabinets, kids had them to take. And also kids were being over-diagnosed with things like ADHD medications, you know? And a lot of kids that I interviewed, I just happened to notice as I was doing my research, and I noticed a lot of the kids that were on heroin had started out abusing ADHD medications and trading it around, and just this notion that it's okay to take a pill for everything really contributed to this as well.
How did it go on such a large scale from being a prescription pill problem to being a street drug, heroin, and then fentanyl as well?
Yeah, so the pills got hard to get, they got expensive, and I think of Tess Henry, the young woman who's also the subject of my podcast that I have coming out, my Audible original. She first got overprescribed in urgent care, and then when the pills ran out and she was hooked, she got them easily on the black market because they were so readily available then. And then a new upscheduling happened of hydrocodone-based pills around 2013. She started getting the pills from a dealer. The dealer could no longer get them, but guess what? He had heroin, and it was cheaper. And she starts out snorting it, just as she had done with the pills, and then when that no longer suffices to keep her from being dopesick, she starts shooting it up. And you see a beautiful girl, an honor roll student, a published poet at 16, basketball player, daughter of a hospital surgeon and a nurse, homeless, estranged from her family, stealing, in and out of jail, in and out of psych centers, ultimately prostituting, ultimately caught up in some really, really bad stuff that she doesn't overcome.
So when this is largely a prescription pill problem, to what extent did regulators, did the federal government sort of become aware, like when did they become aware of this, and what was their response? And was there any response until it became a street drug problem, and what was the response then?
Well, so the FDA allows this special label that had never been before allowed, and all I'll say on that is that the person who stamped approval on the new drug application then goes and works for Purdue Pharma a few years later. The same thing happens at the DEA level. You have people who are supposed to be policing this and reporting suspicious orders who then go to work for pharma and can coach their colleagues on how to get around the new regs. Pharmaceutical companies spent almost $1 billion between 2009 and 2015 on lobbying and political campaigns. This is, in this country, we have given greed-fueled businesses the ability to police themselves, and they simply don't do it.
So you brought up politics. I'm going to go a little bit beyond the timeline of your book, but when President Trump came into office, he said that he was going to declare this a national emergency. Has there been any changes in terms of what the federal government is doing in response to the opioid crisis since then?
There's been a little bit more money, so I think we're up to $6 billion a year now. He said he was going to call it a national emergency, but then he instead called it a public health emergency, which released no real new funds or authorities. There is money coming into federal, through the Cures Act money is coming down, but it's very much a patchwork of care, especially in states. We have 14 states that haven't passed the Medicaid expansion. That is the #1 tool for getting people with opioid use disorder access to these drugs, especially people who are estranged from their families like Tess was. Only 1 in 5 people can access these life-saving medicines, and that's tragedy. The medicines should be at least as easy to get as the opioids were and the street heroin and fentanyl were.
So another thing that's happened subsequent to the publication of your book is that Purdue Pharma they're starting to be held accountable and is in court. And what's the latest update on that? And how effective do you think so far the process of holding Purdue and the Sackler family accountable has been?
Yeah, so it's been a big week just this week. Oklahoma, I can't remember now, it was Monday or Tuesday, but a judge in Oklahoma actually fined Johnson & Johnson $572 million, and that was key because it wasn't a settlement agreement. It was a fine. I mean, of course, they're going to appeal, but they said, you lied about it, you exaggerated the benefits, and then Purdue, perhaps kind of looking and seeing the way the cards are going, now we're going to be called to pay for this. It was reported that they're offering to settle for 10 to 12 billion, but when you think about all the billions that they've made on this, and a lot of parents don't believe that's enough. The parents who lost their children to this drug want them to go to jail.
Do you think that's likely at all?
I don't know at this point. You know, if a lot of these states and cities and towns are eager to take this money because they want it to make these life-saving medications and treatment and transportation to treatment. I mean, in these rural areas, they can't even get to treatment when you live out in these outlying areas, which have some of the highest overdose rates. Housing, things of that nature, syringe exchanges in communities, and harm reduction. There's so much need out there. They made so much money off these drugs, more than 30 billion, and it's basically the public has been left to pay for it.
So I mentioned the Sacklers, but not everyone here might know the connection between the Sackler family and the opioid crisis. In New York, it's been a big story because if you go to any museum, if you go to the Museum of the Metropolitan Museum, there's the Sackler wing. What's going on? Who are the Sacklers and what's going on with them?
So they were three brothers. They bought a company, a little-known company called Purdue Frederick in 1952, they're famous for earwax removal and betadine and things of that nature. And they had actually started into the opioid realm with MS Contin, which was a drug for end of life and cancer pain. And right as that patent was about to expire, they came up with the notion of OxyContin, also sharing the Contin name for continuous, the time release mechanism. And they said, how can we make more money than if it's end-of-life cancer? We're not going to be able to sell that for very long, right? Because the people are eventually going to die. But if we make it available for moderate pain, if we switch that narrative, then we'll be able to sell it to all kinds of people.
And have they, the Sackler, these brothers, I don't know how many of the family members are still alive. Have they admitted to any culpability in this? Have they responded at all directly?
No. Some new documents released this week was a deposition from former chairman Richard Sackler, who is the son of one of the original brothers. And, you know, no.
So in this country, there's always at least one major drug epidemic, it seems, going on at any given time. There was the crack epidemic, there was the meth epidemic. What makes the opioid epidemic different from previous drug epidemics in this country?
Well, just the sheer numbers, you know, and also the fact that there is nobody left unspared by this. Potentially 15 million people. You have communities now, especially in Appalachia and some of those early communities where, well, Factory Men, for instance, set in Galex, Virginia, and Martinsville, they can't get employers to come to these little towns now because not enough people can pass a drug test. So you're talking about entire communities, children in foster care to an extent never before seen.
Is there a racial difference too in terms of who the users are, who the victims are?
Absolutely. So with the crack and cocaine epidemic, largely targeted African American users and largely jailed for that. But with the opioid crisis, African Americans were initially thought to be spared because of racism. Doctors didn't trust them to responsibly use the medicines, so they weren't prescribed at as high a rate as white people were. But now you see, especially in the cities, with the rates kind of going up higher, there is the heroin there is being largely more cut with fentanyl, and you're seeing rates with predominantly fentanyl go up among African American users.
In addition to interviewing many users, recovering users, family members, people who've lost family members to the opioid crisis. You also interviewed a convicted heroin dealer. Why did you decide to do that? What was it like, and what did you learn from this dealer that you wouldn't have really understood about the crisis if you hadn't spoken to him?
That's a great question. I actually interviewed Ronnie Jones, a thrice convicted drug dealer who was accused of, at the time, being the largest heroin dealer in Virginia. And he had infiltrated not Richmond or Norfolk or even Roanoke, but this small little town called Woodstock, Virginia, once idyllic farm town. And as the feds told the story, set about turning a handful of known users into hundreds almost overnight. And as I started to pick apart this kind of pyramid dealer scheme, I interviewed one of the mothers of the children who had died. He was 18-year-old Jesse Ballstridge, and his mother asked me to meet her at the grave site, which she had buried him at the edge of the cemetery right next to the football field where he had once made the crowd roar. He was a great football player and had been initially overprescribed for a sports injury. And she wanted me to answer the question at her son's grave, which had his football number on the big headstone. How did my only son, my beautiful son, end up dead with a needle in his arm on somebody else's bathroom floor? And I felt like it was just, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. If I could help her answer that, then I could help America understand that. So I just started peeling the layers of the onions. I went to the police, the prosecutors. I tracked down his family. I interviewed those who were willing to be interviewed, and then I requested to interview him in prison. And sort of nervous about it. I'd never done a prison interview. They told me I had 2 hours. They let me stay for 6. You can't record in a prison, so my hand was like on ice after 6 hours of interviewing. And what I found was just, it shouldn't have been a surprising story, but it was just a story of a young man who had been promising himself and had been arrested many times early on. I found him sympathetic. Some readers have not found him sympathetic, but we don't do a very good job when people get out of jail. Mm-hmm. People of color are largely incarcerated for drug use and for drug dealing at a much higher rate, even though our usage and our dealing rates are not dissimilar. And he had been profiled numerous times, and he could never get a job. He could never get a job when he got out of prison, even though he had gotten all these degrees in prison, smart guy. And I found him sympathetic.
Your reporting in this, as you said, it came out of Appalachia, and you were a longtime reporter for the Roanoke Times. Mm-hmm. How important has local journalism been to your reporting and the way in which you've approached this and your training, both this book and then your other 2 books? Because It feels like it really comes out of a particular place.
Yeah, so I'm kind of a unicorn in journalism. Most people go to one market, then they move to a bigger market, and I just stayed in the same place because we love where we live and we raise our kids there. And so I have these sources, like it's bad when you want to go to 7-Eleven for half and half in the morning and you're in your pajamas because you will see 10 people that you know, right? But I have really good sources there, and I had great editors at the Roanoke Times that would give me time to explore and really to figure out the best way to write about social issues. I worked with great photographers, too, who would see stories. My first book, Factory Man, was actually the idea of a photographer, Jared Sories, who's based in D.C. now, who saw this story. He said, nobody's writing about the aftermath of globalization. Let's go down to Martinsville and see what we can find. And that was an amazing gift. My second idea, True Vine, also came from a photographer I worked with who said, it's the best story in town, but nobody's been able to get it. And this was my hair was still dark. It was 1989, I think. And so that's a story I pieced at we just got a 5-minute warning. That's a story I pieced at for 25 years.
Wow.
And when do you get the time to try to get somebody to trust you for that long?
Because Factory Man came out in 2014, then True Vine in 2016, but that story you'd been working on sort of all along. Or
Yeah, all three books grew out of a reporting from the Roanoke Times.
Wow. But how different was it to do a story with Truvine that was historical versus ones that the factory man was going on while you were reporting it, right? And
Yeah.
the same thing with Dopesick, to have to go back in time. Was that harder?
It was harder in some ways. I had a real clear narrative structure. So Truvine is about these two brothers who were kidnapped from a rural tobacco field in around 1900 and sold to the circus because of their albinism. And the hero of that story is their mother, who was an illiterate maid in the Jim Crow South, who risks her life to get them back and then sues the circus for their back wages. It's pretty incredible. But a lot of holes in that story because it happened so long ago, so that was the challenge. This book was probably the hardest to write just because it was going on like right before me. Even Factory Man, when I first started, mostly had taken place, like that lawsuit against China, all that had happened before. But this was like, I don't think I could have done this first because I wouldn't have had the confidence to know that I was going to be able to figure out what the narrative was. And so what I did was I knew I wanted to write about OxyContin in the coalfields. I knew I wanted to write about this cell of users in this wealthy suburb called Hidden Valley, ironically. And then I found that third story about Ronnie Jones that I thought said a lot about the failed war on drugs. And then I was like, how do those three stories relate? And how can I weave them in a narrative using I-81 that sort of connected them all, the interstate, and what people call the heroin highway, use that as a narrative thread as well. And I didn't quite know how to do it at first.
You figured it out. How do you, I mean, the Truvine sounds like a little bit of an outlier, so it's more of a historical book, but is there a common thread with you, all three of your books with your work that sort of drives you, some kind of underlying question or theme?
Yes, I always want to tell the story of the outsider and the underdog. And I grew up poor. I was the first in my family to go to college. The kind of poor where you're not sure if the gas is going to get turned off in the winter, that kind of poor. And I've just always had a sense of writing about people who upend expectations, you know, and heroes. I wasn't sure how I was going to do this book because it's so dark, and I'm from a family with 4 generations of addiction. I mean, that I know of.
Alcoholism in your
alcoholism, yeah, going back at least 4 generations. And I thought, how am I going to stay mentally healthy, sort of, and then finish this book? I really was worried. And my friend, who's a writer, Roland Lazenby, said, you do go when you write about the heroes, the people fighting back. And then he quoted Mr. Rogers, which, you know, somebody gonna slap some Mr. Rogers on you. You've got to follow it. He said, find the helpers. So that's what I did. I wrote about the families and the first responders and the first doctor to call Purdue on the phone and say, you guys are lying.
Did that make it easier?
Yes, it made it a lot easier. It was still really, really hard, though. I mean, the main person that I followed was murdered on Christmas Eve. You know, I had just heard from her 3 days before. She was trying to make it home.
I have to ask this. Your website, your URL is Intrepid Paper Girl. Why did you decide to use that?
So I was the first paper girl in my town. I mean, maybe there was one before me, I don't know, but I delivered the paper. And it was kind of all the skills you need to be a reporter in delivering the newspaper.
Really?
Right?
Yeah, you have to explain that.
So it was an afternoon paper, so I didn't have to get up early. That's good. But I had to be consistent, talk to strangers. I love talking to strangers, and then telling people what I learned. And you had to negotiate because you had to collect on Friday and Saturday.
So you were responsible for collecting?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. It was not easy. And so that's what I did. Yeah.
All right, I want to turn it over to everyone else's questions. Thank you for answering all of mine. If you could. We have microphones on either side, so if you want to just line up, we'll go from one side to the next. I can't see the one on this side. I think there's one over here. There is, okay. Well, let's start with you.
So I'm from West Virginia,
Hi.
like 15 minutes from 81, and I work in an MAT clinic. And one of the things that struck me as we were talking was pharmaceuticals' role. I work with these people every day. who are facing opioid crisis is that right now we use Suboxone all the time to treat, and there's no way to wean from Suboxone. And so in my mind, I'm like, wait, we went from one epidemic to another. Has any of that come across in your work?
Yeah, and the science isn't really settled on how long people should be on these life-saving medicines. I had a researcher call me out in Kentucky not long. She said, don't call it MAT, call it medicine. It's a medicine just like insulin is a medicine for diabetics. And they reduce cravings, reduce the likelihood of relapse and death. I had one researcher tell me if you are a heroin user for 6 years, you should be on Suboxone for 12. Nora Volkov at the National Institutes of Drug Abuse would say potentially the rest of your lives. We know that the longer you're on it, even as you wean, maybe in year 5, 4, 5, 6, whatever, even then, even if you're just on a little bit, you're more likely to relapse. And of course now, when people relapse, they might not get heroin, they might get fentanyl-laced heroin, and it's deadly. So these, I know it's ironic, like we gotta have another pill here, but the people that I know that are on these life-saving medications are protected from it.
Over here.
Hi, I've been in the practice of emergency medicine for about 35 years, and about 20 years ago, a fifth vital sign appeared.
Yeah.
It's called pain. And I'm wondering if you could briefly comment on the creation of that, where the responsibility lies for that, and then secondly, a brief opinion about the supervised injection sites.
Yeah, okay, so the pain as a fifth vital sign sort of happened around the same time that the Joint Commission was also saying, now we have to rate your pain in the hospital. The nurses and doctors are maybe they're not gonna be reimbursed if you don't treat people's pain. This was all part of the movement pushed by pharmaceutical companies that were also paying physician groups and sending doctors. I mean, they sent 5,000 doctors, nurses, and pharmacists to become paid spokesman for the company, to go to CMA trainings and resorts wearing OxyContin branded beach hats at the same time. Some of Dr. Van Zie's kids he had immunized as babies were overdosing in the high school library. I mean, and nobody was listening to him. So emergency room doctor, I'm sure you've seen this a lot. How do I feel about supervised injection sites? I'm for anything that meets users where they are and helps them be treated like human beings and not simply moral failures and criminals. And syringe exchanges, safe injection sites, I mean, we know they work because other countries that have allowed them. The closest thing we have in America right now, other than some underground ones that I've heard about, is a place in Boston, out of the Boston Center for the Homeless, where there's a forward-thinking doctor named Dr. Jessie Gaeta, and she allows, I think it's called supportive place for observation and treatment, and people are allowed to come in and be medically monitored and as they write out their highs, right? And it's kind of shocking to see it. People are kind of on recliners and they're being given oxygen, but the whole thing is we're gonna treat you like a human being. A lot of these people are living in homeless encampments. She's now taking buprenorphine out into the encampments and meeting them where they are. But the connections that get made, especially with these folks who stigmatize themselves, they think they're not worthy of medical care. They think they're moral failures. Anything that brings them inside and treats them like human beings, maybe if it's just some guy said, I went into a syringe exchange in New York City 10 years ago. They said, what do you want? What do you need today? And he said, I'm hungry. I need a sandwich. And he said, that sandwich changed my life. Eventually, I became to trust those people who were helping me. And eventually, I got help. And now this guy runs a syringe exchange program in Jamestown, New York, in a former abandoned furniture factory, ironically. So I'm for anything that brings people in and helps them. Thank you.
Hi. I have a cousin who's a scientist. He works with drug companies, and we've had a lot of discussions / arguments about the opioid crisis. And one of our sticking points is, I repeat, what you've told us, which is about the marketing of what Purdue Pharma's marketing of this drugs. And he says that's what all drug companies do. They find doctors who prescribe a lot, they work with them, et cetera. So help me win this argument.
Well, blood pressure medicine and metformin for your diabetes are a little bit different than opioid painkillers. I mean, we knew these drugs were not safe. They changed the narrative. They used faulty data. They plucked 1980 letter to the editor from a New England Journal of Medicine that had nothing to do with outpatient. I mean, they cooked the books, if you will. And we proved they cooked the books when they admitted that they criminally misbranded it. It's a very different thing. This is a much more dangerous drug.
How much money did Purdue make off of OxyContin?
North of 30 billion. Yeah.
All right, over.
I've seen arguments that the Sacklers' names should be taken off of art galleries to which they've contributed, and I was wondering what you think about that, and in particular, what you think about the argument that there was, I believe, one member of the Sackler family who contributed a lot of money to art galleries but got out of the business before
Yeah.
the company started being reckless with its...
Right. Yes, so Arthur Sackler, who was the person one of the three brothers, and he's really the godfather of medical marketing. He's responsible for Valium being called Mother's Little Helper way back in the day. And when he died, his heirs sold their portion of the company to the other two brothers. So that side of the family says that, hey, we're not guilty. Arthur wasn't even alive. We weren't even involved at the beginning of OxyContin, and that's true. But what they did when they went out and oversold and undertold the risks was Arthur Sackler Marketing 101.
Thank you for this reporting. I was wondering, there were pharmacies that basically became sort of pill running centers where they had hundreds of opioid and other drugs that were going through their systems, hundreds per person within their area. Why wasn't this a red flag to law enforcement? Did you ever follow that trail to see what happened on that part of this crisis?
Yeah, the real expert on that is Eric Eyre of the Charleston Gazette-Mail, and they were part of the group that just helped get those documents released showing 76 billion pills between 2006 and 2012. The DEA diversion department was considered a backwater. They weren't given the tools. I mean, there's excuse after excuse after excuse. There was a new law passed by Congress in 2016 that sort of kneecapped the DEA from going after suspicious orders. I mean, a lot of that revolving door stuff that I talked about, where the chief legal counsel at the DEA then goes to work for pharma and then crafts that law that kneecaps the DEA. I mean, we've got to stop the revolving door. Thank you.
My name is Cornbread. I'm from D.C. I have a question in regards to the connection of social, political, and economic conditions and how it connects to the systemic drug ecosystem.
Yeah.
When you look at the social, political, and economic conditions of the 60s, you show a mass flooding of drugs coming into the urban areas because of the political black militancy, the uprising political consciousness, and how that connects with unemployment, economic deprivation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the rural areas now, with the transformation of technology and how we're going into a technological era versus the industrial era and things of that nature, and you look at the rural areas and you see all these people unemployment, and all of a sudden thereafter, you got all this drugs coming in, people on drugs, medication, medicating their depression, unemployment, et cetera. The same connection as it relates to the inner city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So white people wake up, we're all connected in this, and it's the same MO. Philip Agee, it's two names. Philip Agee was a CIA intelligence officer. He died in Cuba. He left the United States in the 70s. He predicted this. Gary Webb, they killed him in a hotel. He predicted this. He unmasked the crack cocaine epidemic in LA. So it's social, political, and economic conditions. And we are all in this together, and people have to start unraveling this and studying this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, yesterday I asked my financial advisor to sell my Johnson & Johnson stock because I didn't want to be associated with them anymore. And I do understand the argument. If I knew what went on in the corporate boardrooms of all the stocks I own, I probably wouldn't own any stocks. But I asked him if any of his other clients had any reservations. He said they hadn't. I asked him his position. He said he was neutral. It could go either way. A lot of people think that the worst has already happened to the Johnson & Johnson stock. But my question is, do you think stockholders have any hope of influencing corporations as stockholders?
Well, I hadn't really thought about that, and I'd certainly never hadn't heard of anyone doing what you did, so kudos to you. Johnson & Johnson, you know, that was just one state. People were pretty excited about that ruling because it was so definitive, and it was actually a lot of money for a smallish state. And it was considered a bellwether for the other cases. So hopefully these things will go forward and we'll eventually get the money to treatment for these communities that have suffered the most. But to your question about the stockholders, that's a little over my pay grade on that, to be honest.
When I first started hearing about the opiate crisis, I was utterly baffled that they had ever been prescribed for moderate, pain relief and chronic conditions, given what we knew about opiates for at least a couple hundred years and probably several millennia. But at the same time, the other thing that's utterly baffled me is that there are some alternate methods, such as marijuana and other things like that out there, that at the same time the OxyContin was getting allowed to be prescribed, there was still tremendous resistance to even doing research into those. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering where the politics are on all of these things that don't have anywhere near the addictive qualities, but are potentially as effective or more effective, can't even really get research support from the federal government. At the same time, they're allowing OxyContin to be sold.
Right, right. And so you start to see the legalization of marijuana. Some experts believe that is part of what drove the cartels to bring in heroin. We're going to lose our money from marijuana, so we've got to make it up some way. At the same time, the pills were getting hard to get. But
at the same time, the legalization of marijuana is occurring essentially before there's any, solid research to back up what it's good for, what it's not good for.
Right, and I get asked that question a lot, actually. What do you think about the legalization of marijuana? I mean, frankly, as a mother of teenagers and young 20-somethings, we know the brain isn't fully developed until 25, and so I have concerns about that. What Nora Volkov at the National Institutes of Drug Abuse would say is that the data on if you have opioid use disorder and you smoke marijuana isn't clear, whereas we have the data on buprenorphine and methadone. And so really important not to confuse those two. We know that methadone and buprenorphine work.
All right, I'm so sorry. I know there are a few more questions, but I'm afraid that we are out of time. I'm going to use the word girl here in spirit, but I think you're very much still the intrepid paper girl.
Thank
so
you.
Beth Macy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you.